The communiqué was 43 pages long. Every G7 communiqué is long. They are built to be long, layered with working group language and appendix qualifications and diplomatic subordinate clauses that allow every signatory to find, somewhere in 43 pages, the sentence that confirms what they needed the document to say. The practice is as old as multilateral diplomacy, and the financial press, which has covered 40 years of G7 summits, knows how to read a communiqué the way a physician reads a chart. Not for what it says, but for what it says differently than the previous one. Paragraph 31 of the 43-page communiqué from the Kananaskis Summit was different from every G7 communiqué paragraph produced in the previous 11 years. It was different in a way so specific, so precisely worded, and so unmistakably deliberate that the senior correspondent for the Financial Times, a woman who has covered every G7 summit since Heiligendamm in 2007, filed her first take before the closing press conference had ended. Her first sentence read, "Paragraph 31 is not boilerplate, it is a verdict." Paragraph 31 did not mention the United States by name. G7 communiqué do not mention member nations by name in the context of criticism. They do not need to. The language of paragraph 31, language that had been negotiated, word by word, across 41 hours of Sherpa meetings over 3 days before the leaders arrived, described, in the formal register of multilateral consensus, a set of trade practices that constituted, in the communiqué's careful phrasing, a structural threat to the rules-based international trading order that the G7 exists to defend. It described those practices as inconsistent with the obligations of membership in the multilateral frameworks that G7 nations had collectively built and were collectively bound to uphold. And it noted, in the sentence that the Financial Times correspondent had filed on before the closing press conference, that the G7 remained unified in its commitment to supporting any member nation subjected to those practices through coordinated trade framework solidarity measures. Every member of the G7 except one had signed paragraph 31. The one exception was not Canada. 6 words that, once understood, reordered everything that followed, spoken in the formal grammar of a multilateral document, rather than in the voice of any single leader, but carrying, in that grammar, a precision that no bilateral statement could have achieved and no unilateral escalation could have produced. The alliance held. The target did not. To understand what paragraph 31 accomplished that 27 months of Canadian bilateral endurance had not yet been able to accomplish alone, you have to understand what isolation actually requires. Isolation, as a trade strategy, has one necessary condition and one fatal vulnerability. The necessary condition is that the target's existing relationships be either too weak to withstand pressure or insufficiently formalized to produce collective resistance. The fatal vulnerability is that isolation fails the moment the target's relationships prove stronger than the isolating party modeled, because at that moment, the strategy does not merely fail, it inverts. The party that attempted isolation becomes the party that has demonstrated, to every other member of the multilateral system, the specific price of alliance membership with the United States. And multilateral systems have long institutional memories. The administration had spent 7 months, through a combination of bilateral pressure, trade framework renegotiation demands, and the selective withdrawal of diplomatic goodwill from allied capitals that had expressed concern about the Canada conflict, attempting to construct the conditions under which Canada's G7 partners would choose bilateral accommodation with Washington over multilateral solidarity with Ottawa. That construction effort had produced as its primary output paragraph 31 of the Kananaskis communiqué, signed by 5 of the 6 remaining G7 members, negotiated across 41 hours of Sherpa meetings, and filed on by the Financial Times correspondent as a verdict before the closing press conference ended. The construction effort had built the opposite of what it intended. The specific mechanism of paragraph 31's coordinated trade framework solidarity measures had been drafted, according to 4 people with direct knowledge of the Sherpa process, not by Canada. Canada's Sherpa had been present for the drafting sessions. Canada's position had been represented in every working group meeting, but the language of paragraph 31, specifically the phrase coordinated trade framework solidarity measures, had been proposed by the German delegation on the 2nd day of the Sherpa meetings and had been adopted, with minor modifications, by the French, Italian, Japanese, and British delegations within 6 hours. Germany had written the mechanism. The other 4 had signed it within the working day. Canada had accepted it in the final session. Canada had not asked its allies to write paragraph 31. Its allies had decided to write it. And here is the detail that separates paragraph 31 from every prior instance of G7 language on bilateral trade disputes. The coordinated trade framework solidarity measures described in the paragraph were not aspirational. They were not a call for dialogue, a framework for consultation, or a commitment to monitor developments. They were operational. The solidarity measures had been developed across the 41 Sherpa hours as a specific set of commercial and financial instruments. An expedited mutual recognition framework for Canadian exports across the 5 signing G7 markets, a coordinated investment facilitation protocol directing G7 development finance toward Canadian infrastructure projects currently seeking capital commitment, a joint procurement preference schedule giving Canadian suppliers priority access to G7 government contract opportunities in sectors directly impacted by American tariff escalation, and a currency swap facility activated automatically if the Canadian dollar experienced pressure exceeding 3% in a 30-day window attributable to bilateral trade dynamics. Not aspirational, not a statement of concern, not a call for the parties to exercise restraint. 4 instruments, operational, designed to function as a collective commercial cushion, absorbing the economic impact of American bilateral pressure on a G7 ally. The G7 had not issued a statement about the Canada conflict. The G7 had built infrastructure for it. Mark Carney said nothing about paragraph 31 for 72 hours after the communiqué's release. His office confirmed he had read it. His press secretary confirmed he had participated in the Sherpa process. When a journalist outside the Canadian Parliament asked him on the 3rd day whether paragraph 31 changed the strategic landscape of the bilateral conflict, Carney paused for 7 seconds, a pause that the pool camera captured in full, and then said the 8 words that have not stopped reverberating in diplomatic and financial circles since: "We are not alone, and we never were." 8 words, spoken without theater, without visible emotion, with the composed precision of a man who had spent 27 months building something that had just been publicly validated by 5 sovereign governments. 8 words that the Financial Times ran as its headline within 40 minutes. 8 words that Goldman Sachs cited in a bilateral normalization probability revision that moved the estimate from 74% to 89% in a single session, the largest single-session movement in the index's 6-year history. Warren Buffett addressed paragraph 31 and the 8 words at his annual shareholder meeting in a response to a question about multilateral alliance dynamics that lasted 9 minutes and that the financial press has described as the most precise public analysis of collective action in a trade conflict he has offered in public life. Buffett said that in 7 decades of observing negotiations, he had encountered, with remarkable consistency, one underappreciated truth about the strategy of isolation. He said, "Isolation is the strategy that punishes the isolating party more than the target, because isolation requires you to believe that the target's relationships are weaker than the target believes they are. When you are wrong about that, and the party attempting isolation is almost always wrong about that, because relationships that have been built over decades are almost always stronger than any single bilateral conflict makes them appear. You do not merely fail to isolate your target. You demonstrate to every party in the system exactly how you treat allies under pressure. And that demonstration is observed, recorded, and factored into the strategic calculations of every party that is currently, or might one day be, in the position your target occupies." He applied it with the full weight of 7 decades. The administration, Buffett said, had spent 7 months attempting to construct the conditions for Canadian isolation. What it had actually constructed was the conditions for German-drafted multilateral solidarity. The 5 signatures on paragraph 31 were not 5 expressions of sympathy for Canada. They were 5 expressions of self-interest by governments that had observed, over 7 months, what the United States did to an ally that held firm, and had concluded that the most cost-effective insurance against finding themselves in that position was a demonstrated willingness to make that position collectively less tolerable. The isolation strategy had not failed. It had backfired. And backfired strategies, Buffett concluded, do not merely lose the current negotiation. They reshape the landscape of every negotiation that follows. The market response was the most unambiguous the bilateral conflict had produced since its opening moves. The Canadian dollar appreciated 2.7% against the US dollar in the 48 hours following the communiqué's release, the largest bilateral currency movement in the conflict's history, surpassing the 2.1% movement that had followed the Bank of Canada's dependency figures technical note. The 5 signing G7 members' collective commitment to the currency swap facility removed, in the assessment of 3 separate sovereign risk analysis teams, the tail risk scenario that had represented the most significant downside pressure on Canadian asset prices throughout the conflict. the scenario in which sustained bilateral friction produced a currency crisis that forced a capitulation on terms favorable to the American position. That scenario was now backstopped by a collective G7 facility. The tail had been cut off. Goldman Sachs described the bilateral situation in a client note issued 48 hours after the communiqué in terms that the prior 27 months of coverage had not produced. The note's central observation was this: for the first 7 months of active escalation, the bilateral conflict had been a bilateral conflict. After Kananaskis, it was a multilateral conflict in which one party had the backing of 5 G7 allies and the other had the backing of its domestic political coalition, which had been publicly fracturing for 11 weeks. That asymmetry, the note observed, was not temporary, it was structural. The G7 solidarity measures were treaty-level commitments. They did not expire when the bilateral mood shifted. They did not depend on electoral outcomes. They were embedded in the multilateral architecture of the rules-based trading order that the 5 signing nations had collectively decided was worth defending, in operational terms, against the specific practices described in paragraph 31. The American response inside Washington was not uniform, and the non-uniformity had a specific geography that anyone familiar with the retaliation lists page 9 could recognize immediately. Republican members from the 5 sectors covered by the G7's Joint Procurement Preference Schedule, automotive components, aerospace subassemblies, agricultural equipment, specialty chemicals, and industrial filtration, faced a new and specific calculation. The G7 preference schedule meant that Canadian suppliers in those 5 sectors now had priority access to 5 sovereign government procurement markets, representing a combined annual purchasing volume of $2.3 trillion. The administration's tariff schedule had been designed to pressure Canadian suppliers in those sectors by restricting American market access. The G7 preference schedule had just replaced that market access with 5 alternative markets at preference pricing, backed by sovereign procurement commitments. The tariff pressure and the procurement preference were pulling in opposite directions. The tariff was trying to close a door. The preference schedule had opened 5 others. The governor of Michigan said 9 words at a press conference the day after the communiqué. The math just changed, and it did not change in our favor. The senator from Wisconsin, who had already entered 11 words into the congressional record 3 weeks earlier, said nothing publicly. His office confirmed he had read paragraph 31. His office confirmed he had requested a meeting with the administration's trade representative. No date for that meeting had been set. And here is the detail that the 41 Sherpa hours had built into paragraph 31 specifically to ensure that the coordinated measures could not be easily unwound by a subsequent bilateral accommodation. The 5 operational instruments, the Mutual Recognition Framework, the Investment Facilitation Protocol, the Joint Procurement Preference Schedule, and the Currency Swap Facility had been structured as amendments to existing multilateral trade framework agreements rather than as standalone bilateral instruments. They could not be withdrawn by a change in Canadian trade policy. They could not be suspended by a bilateral agreement between Canada and the United States. They required the unanimous consent of all 5 signing nations to modify or terminate. The G7 had not written a statement. It had written a structural commitment. The commitment was now embedded in the multilateral architecture alongside the rules it was designed to protect. We are not alone, and we never were. On the surface, those 8 words are a statement of present fact. Canada, at the moment paragraph 31 was signed, had the active, operational, multilateral solidarity of 5 sovereign governments. On the surface, they are the words of a former central banker who has spent 27 months building the bilateral case that Canada's endurance was not dependent on American goodwill, now observing that the multilateral case had been built by 5 other governments without being asked. Beneath the surface, those 8 words carry a meaning that reshapes every prior moment in the conflict's history. They do not say Canada found its allies at Kananaskis. They say Canada never lacked them. The Commercial Realignment Initiative's European and Indo-Pacific integration, the 41 supply agreements, the 312 long-term contracts, the Commodity Settlement Framework's 21 sovereign participants, was not the architecture of isolation survival. It was the architecture of relationship depth that made 5 G7 governments willing to write paragraph 31. Canada had not been alone when the first tariff was announced. It had not been alone when the bond market moved 14 basis points at 3:14 in the morning. It had not been alone in room H-137 or in the Senate Finance Committee briefing room or in any of the 27 months of quiet building that had produced the terrain on which the Kananaskis communique was written. So here is where we stand. At a G7 summit in Kananaskis, 5 of the 6 remaining member nations signed paragraph 31 of the communique. 41 hours of Sherpa negotiation, German drafted, operationalizing 4 solidarity instruments: mutual recognition, investment facilitation, joint procurement preference, and a currency swap facility backstopping the Canadian dollar against bilateral pressure. The one member that did not sign was not Canada. Goldman Sachs moved the normalization probability from 74% to 89% in a single session. The Canadian dollar appreciated 2.7%, the conflict's largest bilateral currency movement. The tail risk scenario was backstopped and removed. The 5 instruments were embedded in multilateral architecture requiring unanimous consent to modify. And Mark Carney, 7 seconds after a journalist asked whether paragraph 31 changed the strategic landscape, offered 8 words that contain the history of 27 months of building in every syllable. We are not alone, and we never were. 61,000 automotive workers in Michigan, $6.2 billion in Ohio industrial exposure, the Wisconsin senator whose meeting with the trade representative has not been scheduled, the governor of Michigan's 9 words about math, Page 9's 17 categories now competing against a $2.3 trillion annual G7 procurement preference in the same 5 sectors, a currency swap facility that removed the tail risk that represented the last viable path to a forced Canadian capitulation, and the Wisconsin senator's office confirming he had read paragraph 31, confirming he had requested a meeting, confirming no date had been set, which is itself a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about where the coalition stands 3 weeks after 11 words entered the congressional record. The questions now being asked in every allied capital, every institutional risk desk, and every administration strategy session that is still capable of honest self-assessment carry the weight of 5 signatures and 41 hours of Sherpa work. Can the administration construct a credible de-escalation framework that accounts for the 5 G7 solidarity instruments now embedded in multilateral architecture, instruments that cannot be withdrawn by bilateral agreement, and that have replaced in 5 sovereign procurement markets the market access pressure the tariff strategy was designed to apply? And if it cannot, what does the bilateral conflict look like when one side has a fracturing domestic coalition, a 74% normalization probability that moved to 89% in a single session, and a G7 peer group that just built 4 operational instruments to make continued bilateral pressure progressively less effective? But the question that will define the next chapter is the one Warren Buffett posed at the end of 9 minutes that the financial press has not stopped quoting. When an isolation strategy builds the opposite of isolation, when the 7 months spent constructing the conditions for Canadian isolation produce instead a German-drafted, 5 nations-signed, structurally embedded multilateral solidarity mechanism, who is actually more isolated at the end of it? The country that tried to isolate its ally, or the country that discovered, when the communiqué was released, that its allies' relationships had been deeper than every model and every assurance had suggested? The administration tried to isolate Canada. Canada was building relationships while the strategy was being designed. 5 governments decided in 41 hours of Sherpa work that the answer to the question of how to respond to the specific practices described in paragraph 31 was not a statement. It was infrastructure. And standing outside the Canadian Parliament, 7 seconds after a journalist asked whether the landscape had changed, the man who had spent 27 months building alongside those relationships gave the answer that 27 months of building makes possible. We are not alone, and we never were. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.